So tonight is the first night of this program that I'm calling 50 Days of Easter. And it's really, in some ways, a development of the Yes program that we began way back in Lent. Time to reflect, and but it's also a program, I will admit, that I am building while we're flying, in terms of the exercises and some of the activities and the thoughts. So basically what I plan on doing is every day there will be an email with a reflection, some sort of comment, note, just a thought for the day. It won't be very long. And there may also be some little video clips. I'm hoping to have little video clips with maybe an exercise or an activity or something on that's better listened to rather than read. So that's the plan, and there will be one substantial piece of work where I'll get you all to engage with one another and to do some shared storytelling. I'll also let you know that shared storytelling, we will also be doing a version of that within a month's time, probably virtually if we're still locked down, which I'm guessing we will be given the way things are going. And that will be part of the search process. So some of this will be parallel to that. And a big piece of the 50 Days of Easter is really about you individually, and the work that we will do as part of the search process for the search committee will really about us as a congregation, but they're kind of parallel in some of the things that we'll be thinking about. So I want to come back to this first week to be thinking about how we encounter God in our daily life, and particularly in Easter, how do we encounter the risen Christ? I find it really fascinating that the stories of the resurrection, appearances of Jesus seems incredibly elusive. He sort of shows up almost unannounced and then disappears. And I would say that's very normal in my personal spiritual life, that Jesus in some ways is very unpredictable in terms of how we encounter him. And so I mentioned in the very first class, or the first email that I sent out, my experience is that there are often questions that I will wrestle with for days, months maybe, and really struggle with, and almost to the point that the question will drive me crazy because I just can't seem to get an answer. And I'll talk to all the wise people that I know who seem to be further down the road than I am, and even though they will tell me examples or answer my question, it just doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to make sense. And I think a large part of it is because when the risen Christ shows up, the experience isn't just simply an intellectual one, that something is happening at a much deeper, more profound, and it's even beyond emotional. And so here's an example of how I've experienced that. And this was, way back before I went off to seminary. I kept in my mind was this question: what is grace? What is grace? And I would ask different people I respected, and what is grace? And the classic response was unmerited favor. And I thought, that's nice, but it just doesn't have any impact. You know, I could, if I was doing a a quiz, for example, I could accept that as the right answer, but it really didn't have any impact on me, didn't have any impact on my life, and was not satisfying. And that question kind of haunted me, I suppose you'd say, for several months. I just couldn't, I wanted to know what grace was and didn't get any answer. And I was pondering this question. It's one of those things that whenever I have these kinds of experiences, and I don't know about you, but they are so graphic. It's not that I actually necessarily see something, but I still very much remember the surroundings. And I was actually living at the time on the dairy farm where I grew up, and I'm standing at the kitchen table pondering this great question: what is grace? And the picture that came into my mind was heaven filled with Hindus. And I just got radically offended. And I said, what are they doing there? They had, at least I believed in you. And in that moment, the words that came to me, it was almost like the voice of God came to me, says, now you understand grace. That grace is from God. In fact, everything we have is grace. And I think one of the big mistakes that in the Protestant world particularly, but the Catholic world and the Orthodox world have their variation on it, they all make this faith journey that we're on dependent on some action of ours. So it's like you've got to be born again, you've got to ask Jesus into your life, you've got to have faith, for example, you've got to believe, you've got to belong to the right church, you've got to be involved in the right worship, you've got to do something. And the moment you put that you've got to do something, you're making it a work. And that your whole faith experience is actually now dependent on you, which means that you're in charge of it. And clearly, one of the things that all the stories of the risen Jesus and his appearance was that the people couldn't control that. They couldn't simply go looking for Jesus. But he would continue to show up on his terms and not on our terms. And the idea that we can control that, or that we want to be in charge of it. And so it's just like, tell me exactly what I need to do. Believe, have faith, do something. And it's almost like it's a way of getting God into a spiritual half Nelson where God has to do what it is we want him to do because we've done what we think we're supposed to do. And that I think faith and being aware of the risen Christ requires actually enormous humility, a willingness to simply make oneself available and to be open. And then it is, I think, that we will experience something similar to what I was writing about yesterday, where on the Emmaus Road, we will discover Jesus in unlikely places, almost in the stranger, or when we're least expecting it. And we may not recognize it initially, but then we see him. And I know for me, over the years, I found it much easier in some ways to be aware of two things. One of them is where I see love in action. And the other place is to be aware of the things that evoke delight in me. And when I think of delight, that experience of delight, and you can take a moment and just ponder, who do you know has really delighted in you? And you will find that the people who have delighted in you through the course of your life have done so independent of what you can do or have done. It's just pure delight. And my archetype for being delighted in, the person who delighted in me in some ways, was my maternal grandmother. And she died when I was about 7, and I didn't really see her that often because we lived some distance from her. But I remember this one day after we'd traveled in the car for about 4 or 5 hours over gravel roads. It was really miserable getting there, and I'd been car sick, and it was pretty horrendous kind of journey. And I walked into her kitchen, and she was just so delighted in my presence in her place. In that moment, I felt incredibly cherished, and I knew within a shadow of a doubt that I was her favorite grandchild. Now, I know, knowing that lady and knowing my other cousins, they all had that same experience from her. They would have all said that they were the special one. But she had a way of delighting in, and I was only probably 3 or 4 at that time. I'd done nothing for this lady except show up. And she cherished my very existence. So first thing is just take a moment and contemplate and ponder. Who has cherished your existence? And what I know is that all sorts of people have, but you wouldn't have survived if somebody hadn't. And it's possible to get to those places, well, no one loves me, no one's ever loved me. And that's what we become aware of. But if you look at the research on infants in neonatal units, there's a thing called failure to thrive. And what they have is nurses will, or people will actually come in and just stroke the back of these little infants. And I think it's about acknowledging their existence. And to think if somebody is going into a hospital just to do that, this child has done nothing for that person, but someone is there to cherish them. And without that, what the research would show that those children fail to thrive and would die. And the horrendous example of that is sort of before the Second World War, the Nazis had decided to breed the super race. And they literally had the most talented scientists and academics mated with the bright women, and they raised all these children, but they kind of warehoused them. And most of those children died simply because there was no one there to cherish their existence. So as you think of who delighted in you, take a moment and also ponder, who do you delight in? Who do you cherish? And also, at a much simpler level, just think back over the course of the last couple of days. What's evoked delight in your heart and mind? I think, for example, of I walked outside this morning and the trees have been slowly greening up, and there's been a couple of magnolias down the road which were out a couple of weeks ago. But this morning I really noticed we have a big maple with the coppery red colored leaves, and it's in full leaf out in the front yard, and it's just been a big, huge, barren tree since I arrived here. And I was like, whoa, this is cool. And to experience that sense of delight. So I wonder what kind of things have brought delight to your heart and mind this past few days. And this is the part of the resurrection story for me, is that sense of delight that you have experienced, that is the way God beholds you. And I think of the incredible stories in John's Gospel that we had last Sunday, when Mary Magdalene didn't recognize him until Jesus called her by name. And to simply be aware of God's love and God's delight in you. And that this is actually the beginning place of the spiritual journey. It's often, we get it all backwards from my perspective. We think that that's the end place, is to arrive at that place where we discover that God loves us. But actually, that's the place we begin from. And being loved by God can never be the goal of the spiritual journey, simply because it's actually the starting point. And before you even started on the journey, you were loved. And so this whole spiritual journey actually occurs in the context of God's love. There's nothing you can do to earn it. Just like, take a breath. Did you do anything to earn the air that you breathe? It's just there. And St. Paul says in the Acts of the Apostles, after he says that whole thing about in him you live and move and have your being, if you read on down in that, when he's talking to the Areopagites, he basically says that you cannot even take a breath without God being present. And I think that's why in a lot of the meditation exercises that people have developed, taking a breath, being aware of the breath of God, being aware of your own breath is really important, because you couldn't be doing that if God wasn't present. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and open it up for questions, and then I've got an exercise to do with you, just a sort of a meditation kind of exercise. So if anyone wants, you'll have to unmute yourself, but I'd be happy to entertain questions, comments, reflections.
Father Rob, this is Jeff. I have one, but it's a two-parter, and I probably should save the second part till afterwards. The first part is the question of Jesus being elusive. I believe he's with us when we follow his first two commandments, and I think he said something like, what you do to the least and weakest, you do to me, Jesus. So what
I
I'm
would
trying
agree with
what I'm
you,
trying to
Jeff. You know, the piece of it is like, well, he's elusive. It's actually, I don't think he ever left. It's just that in our consciousness, we are not aware of him.
Yeah, and that's my foundation stone for this is sort of kludgy's the wrong adjective, but Belinda Carlisle sings a song, "Heaven is a Place on Earth." I think Jesus told us how we can make earth in the now better with our by joining with our neighbors and helping our neighbors. We help ourselves, and I think the COVID pandemic shows that a house divided falls, and we all have to just sort of do a all for one and one for all type thing. I know the Bible doesn't have the three musketeers, but I had to throw that in.
Well, I think that you know, if you want to live as an individual, then you will be into that highly competitive kind of existence. But on the other hand, the realization that we are all part of something far greater than ourselves, and it's not just us on our own, and that when I wash my hands, I'm in part washing the hands of humanity. That we're all in this together, and it's not just about me protecting myself, but it's also about my protecting others. And I didn't even realize, you know, the whole thing about face masks, for example. You know, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to go out, I'll put my face mask on because I don't want to breathe in any germs. But the interesting piece of that, a big part of the reason for wearing a face mask is so that if you are infected, you're not breathing out all these germs onto other people. So it's not just about protecting yourself, it's protecting humanity from the virus. So I think that awareness is that we're all in this together is really important. But that goes, I think, beyond just dealing with this virus. It's this human experience that we are going through, humanity. We're not just doing this alone. We have to be doing it together, and the capacity to collaborate with others is essential. If we're to resolve anything issue in the world, it's together we will do it. It's not as individuals. Any other questions or comments, reflections? What the heck are you talking about, Rob?
Rob, this is Dan Dugan. I think I heard you say a little while ago that maybe Jesus never left. Could you address that a little more?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Oh, did you say Jesus never left?
Right.
Could you address that a bit more?
Well, I think, you know, it's kind of at a philosophic level, you could say, is there a place where God is not? And obviously, God is bigger than anything, everything. So there can't be a place where God is not. God is in all things, inhabits all things, which means that he is inhabiting us. And I think for a big part of it is that the great lie is that we are separated from God. And I know the word atonement, I know when I was in seminary, we studied all the theories of atonement. And for whatever reason, none of them ever made a whole lot of sense to me. I'm not sure why, but that's just the way it was. But it wasn't until years later, someone said, look, Rob, look at the word. at one meant. And the meant is, if you translated that from whatever, I think it's probably Latin, it's at one with. Atonement means that we are at one with God. And so we're having I spend all my time trying to understand the theories of how that actually could be, rather than just sit back and enjoy the fact that I was now at one with God. And that was God's doing in Jesus, and had in some ways nothing to do with me. That's God's business. And as I was writing the reflection for today about Jesus said, well, I'm going to Galilee, tell the guys to catch up with me, and I'll see them in Galilee. And then pondering, so what is Galilee? And Galilee was Jesus' home, and it was the disciples' home. They'd gone to Jerusalem, which was in Judea, which is south of Galilee. But he basically said, look, I'm going home. I'll meet you there. And so he was telling the disciples, go back home. And as I pondered that, I began to think, home. So there's two kind of homes. There's this external house that I live in. But there's a home inside of me where I live. Now, we might call it our heart, our soul. We have all sorts of different words for it. But there's a place inside of us where we live that's home. And what I was aware of is, if you were to clean out the clutter of your heart, you may discover that Jesus is already there, because he went before you. And he is already within our hearts. It's not, we don't have to get him in there, because he already is. So I think, and I would say a big piece of meditation practice, for example, in the life of prayer, is you don't start with getting Jesus into your life. You start from the place of becoming aware that Jesus is already present. And I think often we start from the other perspective. If I really do this right and have the correct teacher and do the correct prayers exactly right, then maybe Jesus will show up. And I think, I don't think that's true at all. I think Jesus is already there. What we're needing to do is to open our inner eyes and awaken to that reality that's never been anything other than that. Does that answer your question?
Well, thank you. It's you might say I'm delighting in your response. I'm tempted to ask you a little bit about Marcus Borg, but you don't have to. This is optional. I don't know. Does Marcus Borg maybe talk a little bit about a pre-Easter Jesus and a post-Easter Jesus? Maybe those expressions are not always helpful. Maybe they are.
Well, I think, and that this is where we're getting to, is that the pre-Easter Jesus was the human incarnation of God. The post-Easter Jesus, from my perspective, is the risen Messiah. The risen Jesus becomes the risen Christ. And the Christ, this would be my understanding as of today, it could change, but this is where I've been going, is that I would call the Christ the universal Christ. And so particularly if Paul, because Paul never knew the pre-Easter Jesus, and he very rarely ever refers, I think there may be one or two passages in his epistles where he really refers to Jesus. He just about always refers to Christ, which is the post-resurrection and ascended Christ. And if you were to have, if Paul was to write, for example, the prologue of John's Gospel, I think he would have probably written it, in the beginning was the Christ, and the Christ was with God, and the Christ was God. That Christ is the universal presence of God in the universe, and it's what holds the universe together. And that Christ was made man, became flesh, and lived among us as a human being. But clearly the post-resurrection Jesus, the post-resurrection Christ, is different than the pre-resurrection. As far as I know, now Jesus did walk on water, but there are no reports of him sort of miraculously going through walls or turning up and appearing. That there was, and his physical presence wasn't recognizable, but the timeless nature of his being was very recognizable. So when he said Mary's name, Mary, she recognized this is Jesus. She didn't recognize his physical form, but she recognized that timeless part of Jesus calling her Mary. And I think we recognize the risen Jesus when we see love in action, when we see things that are consistent with the nature of Christ, or the nature of the pre-Easter Jesus. But there is clearly from the scriptures a difference. And the one that we experience is really the post-resurrection Christ, which is what Paul experienced. That temporal Jesus that existed 2,000 years ago is not, well, died on the cross, and so it's not, he isn't that, Jesus is not present, but the risen Christ, which is the resurrected Jesus, is present, if that, you want to make that distinction. And it's that risen Christ that we encounter.
Thank you for sharing.
Well, if there are no other questions, I have an exercise to invite you to do. And this is in part, it's kind of the exercise that I'd laid out on the very first day, and sometimes it's easier to be led through it than to read it and kind of do it. But it's also for those of you who, when we're doing the YES program and we're looking at some of the crazy gods and what do you do if you have a really crazy god, and I think particularly the crazy god that seems to abound in our society is very much the punishing god, but there are lots of other ones. But if you're bothered by any of that, where the fruit of your spiritual life isn't a life of joy, isn't a life of peace, or if you're not growing in those timeless qualities of love and joy and peace, then it may be that the image of God you've got is problematic. And so what do you do? What can you do? Well, as I mentioned back before in the YES program, what we have to do is get rid of the images of God. And not talking simply about physical images of God like a statue or something that we've carved ourselves or made, but particularly the images of God that we have between our ears. And so think about letting go of those. So here's the exercise. Just invite you, take a deep breath, and then take your pulse. And when you can feel your pulse, just keep your fingers on either your neck or your wrist as we go through this exercise, because we'll come back and just get you to attend to your pulse. And as you're aware of your pulse, you can ponder the question as to why you have a pulse. And you could, or you may say, well, the answer to that is because your heart's beating. And so just let your attention, as you feel your pulse, just to be aware of your heart beating. And as you're aware of your heart beating, you can ponder, why does my heart beat? What's inside of me that causes my heart to beat? And you may think, well, it's my brain sending impulses to my heart, what have you. Well, question is, what's causing your brain to do that? At some point, you'll just need to be aware that the reason you have a heartbeat is because you're alive. And so as you're aware of your pulse and your heartbeat, just be aware of the life that is within you, that you're alive. And notice that you never had to work for this life. It was given to you before you were born. It's within you. And you have your own life, or the life that's within you. I have mine and you have yours. Until a few months ago, I didn't know any of you. And I had life, and you had life. Your life's not dependent on me, and mine isn't dependent on you. At this moment, we are sharing life. But the life that animates my heart is within me. And it's kind of wild because it goes wherever I go. It goes with me to the market. It goes with me to church. It goes wherever I go. But just keep being aware of your pulse. And as you do so, I want you to remember the time when you screwed up the worst. when you did something for which you're really ashamed. And here's the amazing thing about the life that's within you. The next day after you had really, really messed up, it never came to you and said, Rob, you really messed up yesterday and I'm leaving. And I'm not coming back until you show us period of remorse. It never did. It never abandoned me. And the invitation it gives us continually over and over again is to come and join it. That it offers me life unconditionally. And it's never abandoned me. And Parker Palmer, the Quaker scholar and writer, to paraphrase one of his comments, he said, now we ponder what we're going to do with our life. He's basically said that's the wrong question. What we need to do is ask the question, what does our life want to do with us? And what would happen if we surrendered to the life that's within us? Not that we would try and control it, but that we would let our life animate our whole being and the things that we do in the world. And as we contemplate and ponder this life that's within us, we can also wonder, where does this life that's within me, where does it stop? And where does God begin? And you'll pretty quickly realize that that's a stupid question. Because I think the life that's within us and God are one. And if you have trouble saying yes to God, I'd invite you to ponder, can you say yes to the life that's within you? Yes to that which is giving you a heartbeat? Yes to that which is animating your body and your mind, your heart? And you can take another breath and be aware that you can't breathe without God being present. And to know that the very presence of God and God's life that is already within you this is the beginning place of the spiritual journey, not the destination. And what the risen Christ shows to us is that there is nowhere that you and I and humanity can get to that is beyond God's capacity to give life, to love, to manifest grace. And to think through as we think about Jesus and the risen Jesus we've talked about tonight. As you read these stories in the different Gospels, listen to the tone of Jesus' voice. When he talks to Peter, when he talks to Thomas, to Mary, to the other disciples, that his words are full of delight and his cherishing of the people he called his friends. That tonight he delights in you, cherishes your very existence. And to allow that to be the beginning point and the foundation of our journey with God. Particularly for these 50 days of Easter. That we may experience, both individually and as a community of St. Peter's, new life. Life in the risen Christ. So just take another breath and let your attention return to our conference call. Bring with your attention your awareness of God's presence and the understanding that God has never been away. He has always been present. Here's what I'd like to do now is simply end the call. If you have questions or comments or thoughts, feel free to email them to me, and I'll be happy to respond to you, but I think I'd rather just leave you here with whatever is happening between you and the Spirit of God. So I think I'm going to sign out and say good night, and I wish you all a wonderful 50 days of Easter. Good night, folks.